lemons from New York. How they came here, we don't know. They just came here. You want us to ask the lemons how they came? How did you come here? He says by truck.
Since the beginning of civilization, people have used the environment to grow crops. Creating food is the major activity of agriculture. Waiters, grocery clerks, and bakers. Like farmers, they depend on agriculture for their jobs, as we all do for our food. In this program, we will look at the sustainability of how we grow crops in soil, here in North America. In the 1830s, John Deere invented the steel plow. It was the start of mechanization. And for those who could afford to purchase the plow, farming became easier and put a vast amount of land in cultivation. After the Second World War, chemicals were introduced as a means of fertilizing the soil and controlling harmful pests. Sustainable development. The widespread use of this term began with the United Nations report, Our Common Future. Sustainable development is a decision-making process that considers our need to keep our planet alive, stay healthy, and make sure there are the goods we need and enough jobs, now and in the future. Sustainable development can be symbolized by a triangle within a circle. The circle represents the natural cycles of our world and the harmony of the native medicine wheel. Three components make up the triangle: economic, which means how each possible choice affects businesses, jobs, and money; environmental, which means how the world around us could be affected; and the third part, health of society, which is how each option would affect the quality of our lives. Sustainable action creates a balance between the three parts, making sure that no part destroys another, and life on Earth continues indefinitely into the future. Central America was home to the old empire of the Mayas. Anthropologists tell us the Mayas abandoned their cities every 50 years or so. After their fields were worn out, with the nutrients in the soil used up, the Mayan farmers moved to other clearings. Eventually, the available land supply simply became exhausted. The Mayas were forced to leave their cities and move on to new, fertile soil. The Mayas practiced a kind of farming that was ultimately unsustainable.
My name is René Lafont. This is my father, Olivier. We've been farming here since, I started in 1982. I took over the family farm, and my dad started farming around 1940.
1940, yeah.
And his father came in 1909 to Manitoba.
My name is Clark Phillips. My partner, Susan Tyler, and I farm this farm in southern New Brunswick near Sussex. It's a mixed farming operation. It's certified organic.
Both Renee and Clark produce crops, although their methods are different. What are the major issues of sustainable development that we have to think about in agriculture? First of all, we have to think about producing crops over a long period of time. We also have to think about the effects that agricultural activities have on the environment, both on and off the farm.
Well, without soil, we'd all be dead. Well, the relationship between the soil and food quality is quite close. It's more so in certain crops, like leafy crops, for example. There's quite a dramatic difference between things grown in soils of different fertility. Spinach leaves, for example, are very sensitive to differences. And you can have a difference of over 100 times, for example, in the amount of manganese in that spinach leaf, or 50 times in the amount of iron.
Soil is a mix of minerals, air pockets, water, and organic matter that lies on the surface of the earth. It is filled with living things.
You know, when you look on the landscape, you see perhaps a forest or a field full of cattle. And the thing to remember is that however much you see above the surface of the soil, there's always more life beneath the surface of the soil. There's three different worlds in the soil, because the soil is made up of little particles which sort of touch one another. And in between them, there's spaces. And some of that space has got water in it, particularly the water that's surrounding the particles. And so for an organism living in the soil, they've really got three choices of how to live there. One is to live in the water film around the particles, and they're just like things that would live in the river, but on a very small version of that, and little little worms and little one-celled animals and so forth. And then there are things that wander around in the air spaces, and they would include mites and springtails and little insects and all sorts of other little miniature things. And they're limited by the size of the environment. And then there are things that can create their own space, like earthworms that can burrow and push their way through the soil. Well, the soil generally has been getting worse since the agricultural revolution, largely because the process of breaking up the ground exposes it. We've eventually evolved a very exposing sort of agriculture.
To prosper, we need productive soil now and in the future. Yet farming can make soil less fertile and more susceptible to erosion. Cultivating the soil, by turning it over and over, leaves it exposed to sun, wind, and water. If the crops are harvested or taken off the fields without organic matter being returned to the fields, the soil is further degraded. These factors lead to the loss of valuable topsoil. Topsoil that can get blown around in dust storms or settle as silt in rivers. Working together, farmers and government have implemented programs to control erosion.
Morning. Glad to come here today. We're going to have a planting of 200 Manitoba maple trees. One of the tools that we have to combat soil erosion is a shelter belt. And a shelter belt not only reduces wind velocities and speeds, and if you notice that you're on a very light sandy type soil, this is where they come into, sorry about that, they come into use. A shelter belt tree or row will protect on the downwind side approximately 15 times its height.
An even more effective way of protecting the topsoil is keeping the ground covered with a layer of vegetation. René Lafond uses a method called zero-till. He leaves stubble on his fields in order to stop erosion.
I started doing some direct seeding into the stubble. By leaving the stubble up in the fall, it traps the snow, so you don't get the wind erosion and the water erosion.
What is organic farming?
It's a way of farming that looks at the soil and says, I'm going to build up the soil. We build up the organic matter. We only till those strips of ground that we're ready to plant, and we leave these strips of triple mix here, there, here, there. When you increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, it tends to make the structure of the soil such that it holds together better. It's not as easily affected by the water. I mean, if you take plain sand, for instance, all right, and pour water on it, it'll run off and make a hole. But if you take some of this soil here and pour water on it, it'll tend to stay together. And it's because of the increase in organic matter. The water was running between these two rows. It ran through here, exposed these rocks, carried off this fine silt, but then we got it. We stopped it right here. It got into this clover, and it dropped any silt that it was carrying. It dropped it right there. And if we look over here on the other side of the clover, no water came out here. So it worked.
If agriculture is to be sustainable, it is necessary that the topsoil be cared for and not allowed to erode. The loss of topsoil not only affects the environment, but threatens the productivity of the farm.
Nutrients are lost from the soil, of course, when you harvest a crop. And fertilization is putting nutrients back into the soil, and this can be done in many ways, from adding compost and well-rotted manure to planting green manures, crops that actually put nitrogen into the soil, or that fix nitrogen, take it out of the air and put it into the soil. Or, of course, various types of fertilizers. There's chemical fertilizers, there's mineral-based fertilizers, and so on. So it's anything that put some fertility or nutrients back into the soil.
Plants mostly get their nutrients from the soil, and the ones that we generally think about as the dominant ones are nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, but they get many, many other nutrients, all the different metals, and they all come from the soil, and that's how they get to us and enable us to produce our red blood cells and repair our bones and produce our teeth and all those things.
We're soil testing all the time every year for fertilizer and all that, and we just add what's ever needed.
So I mean, in the prairies, in the best soils, we've lost over half the organic matter content, and if you put a price on that, it's probably greater than the national debt.
But in organic farming, your plants need to eat too.
Well, and you do that by working with the soil and making the soil strong and healthy. The basic rotation that we use is based on triple mix, which is a mixture of 2 clovers and timothy. The thing is, this is what we've got right now. We just tilled this. This is what we tilled a week ago. And already this stuff is broken down and gone into the soil. So in 1 week, we've gone from that to this, and all of that is in here. That's what makes it work.
I think cows, like any herbivores, are great animals to supplement food and the environment of a farm. They can eat grass, so we can produce food for people using something that we can't eat. You create quite a bit of manure in the barn, which you clean out and pile. You include the bedding, of course, when you put the manure out, and that provides carbon, and the manure composts, and we use that on our fields. So the cows provide us with a lot of basics for our farm.
Compost can be a good source of nutrients, but cannot meet all the needs of a growing crop. Like us, plants need to eat. However, too much fertilizer, whether organic or chemical, can run off into the water supply, damage the environment, or hurt the plants they were meant to feed. How important is the organic matter and the tiny life in the soil? Can we substitute their natural effects on a crop with a synthetic fertilizer? Is it possible for every farm to use Clark and Susan's methods? What is practical? Should we depend on synthetic agents to protect our crops? There are weeds, insects, and diseases that can damage our crops. All farmers must protect their crops, but how can they do this in ways that do not harm the environment, the health of the farmer, or even our own health?
We can't use too much chemical. We go by the Manitoba Agriculture guide for chemicals, and it's all been tested already by companies before they put a chemical out. All the tests are done for the government regulations. And for crops, we can only put just a small amount, whatever is required. We have to go by what the book says, because you'll have injury to your crop if you put too much, or if you put too less. If you don't put enough, then it won't work.
René Lafon takes great care when applying pesticides. He wears safety equipment and follows the government-approved handling instructions. A majority of farmers in North America use similar methods.
In fact, the natural state of a root of a plant in the soil is to have the surface of the root covered with beneficial microorganisms, which will actually prevent a lot of the pests or the diseases from attacking them. We've come along and synthesized all sorts of chemicals that didn't naturally occur, and we're releasing them into the system, and agriculture is one of the places where we do that. And all that life out there has not been used to these sort of chemicals coming out there, raining on them, and so they cause problems. We've got to be very, very careful with chemicals that don't have a counterpart in nature. And that includes most of the early pesticides we use, the chlorinated hydrocarbons and some of the other pesticides.
Organic farmers do not put synthetic chemicals onto their fields. How can they control pests? One method, using the natural enemies of pests to control their population, is being researched globally, including at McGill University. It is also in everyday use at an Ontario stable.
In the natural world, there are all sorts of interactions between organisms. And basically what we're trying to do is manipulate, in an ecological way, those interactions. So basically just tip the balance so that you favour the organism you want and you disfavour the organism you don't.
So this may look like an ordinary family of ducklings, but in fact what we have here is the fly control system for the barn. They have a voracious appetite for flies. They run around and snap up flies as fast as you can see them. And we got them, we had ducks in the barn for the first time last year, and we noticed a tremendous reduction in the number of flies around.
In the past, we have damaged the environment through the use of synthetic chemicals. DDT, once widely used as a pesticide, was restricted in 1974. This was because it caused deformities, cancers, and reproductive problems in wildlife, as well as problems with human health. The registration of DDT was discontinued in 1985.
We have an economic system that is incapable of fully pricing all the factors that contribute to the cost of food production and distribution. So, for example, most of the environmental degradation that is associated with food and agriculture system is not included in the price of our food.
Because of past mistakes, some people believe our food is unsafe. Others believe that someone else will always look after them. Let's look at the two extremes.
Me having 2 kids, I try to buy a lot of fruit, a lot of vegetables, you know, and a lot of juices just to keep them healthy. But, you know, you spend so much money on this stuff, and then you know that half of it is poison, you know. I mean, all the pesticide and everything on there, like you're just killing them anyway, and you're trying to keep them alive, you know, like what do you do?
The way that farmers do their farming through chemicals and fertilizing and all that, it doesn't affect me because the government has a system called the Food and Drugs Act, and they grade the food and make sure it's all right to put it out on the shelves of stores and all that. I haven't got sick of eating bread or a hamburger off the shelves or something, so.
The previous 2 students have wildly different beliefs on how farming and food affect our health. Both these perceptions are often repeated in our society. Our government has laws in place to grade our food, but we are all responsible for what we eat. One thing we can all do is look carefully at the labels on food before we buy. How was the food grown? Where did it come from? How nutritious is it? One practice which all farmers agree upon is crop rotation. For example, a field full of wheat one year could be planted in peas the next to add nitrogen to the soil.
One of the things is you can use crop rotation to manipulate the soil fertility, okay? You need a more fertile soil in order, for instance, to do corn than you do for peas or beans.
If you keep seeding wheat on wheat on wheat, you'll eventually get disease and your yields come down.
So what is the difference between Renee's zero-till style of farming and Clark and Susan's organic farming? Renee uses fertilizers and pesticides, which are manufactured from non-renewable resources. He relies on crop rotation to break pest and disease cycles while helping with the fertilization. He seeds directly into stubble to keep the ground covered, which controls erosion. Clark and Susan use organic fertilizers and, like Renee, rely on crop rotation. Renee believes that in the long run, to grow grain on the prairie, a large operation can produce at a lower cost per hectare than a smaller farm. This concept is called economy of scale. Renee buys expensive fertilizers, pesticides, and the equipment needed to use them.
The seeder, that's over $60,000. And then the combine, the one over there is over $70,000. Tractor to use, that tractor would be around $35,000, $40,000.
Clark Phillips, who grows vegetables on a substantial yet smaller scale than Renee, has farm inputs that are relatively low cost, but his farm requires much more labor.
Our highest costs are in labor. We have to hire more people to deal with the weeds because we don't use herbicides. And that means that every year, even though we don't have a large acreage, we have a significant number of people from the local community working for us. And in the Maritimes, that's really important because the unemployment is very, very high here. And they're quite happy to work through the summer. And it helps to keep things together in the countryside.
David Reibling, an organic miller near Toronto, has had a different experience.
The interesting thing that happened to us several years ago when we had tried the vegetable end of things, which is labor intensive, we could not hire people to work in the vegetable fields. Our society has learned that they don't have to do back-breaking work because they can walk in and get welfare any day.
We've talked about methods for solving the problems of fertility and pest control: natural, synthetic, organic, or chemical. How do these methods affect our economy, our health, and our environment? These are the questions we have to ask when we talk about sustainable development.
The farmers are in a particularly difficult situation in this country and in the Western world in general, in that they really don't have any control over what it costs them to produce their food, and they don't have any control over the prices they get at the other end. The result of that is it makes it extremely difficult for a lot of farmers to try and farm in a sustainable way.
For instance, like on a loaf of bread, which costs over $1, around $1.25 at the store, we get about 2 cents. Why we keep farming if we barely make ends meet? So we always hope for a better year. Once you're in it, to get out of it is very hard. Like you just can't get out of it. If the prices are very low, nobody will want to buy the land.
You've got a lot of poor people that can't afford to spend a lot of money on food. So when the prices of food goes down by using chemical fertilizers to grow more food so that you can sell it for cheaper, that somewhat helps out the poor people.
We sell food largely on the basis of its cosmetic appearance. And so there's an assumption that that's got something to do with nutritional status.
Canada wastes a lot of food, and I think that something that would really help hunger in Canada is if people would recognize poverty and quit being so picky about little dents in their apples and things like that. And I mean, Safeway throws out tons and tons and tons of fruit and vegetables. And me and my uncle were investigating once how to break into the garbage bins to garbage pick it because there is so much stuff there. And they lock it. They it's like mega locks, mega security system around the garbage there.
I mean, if you go into the supermarket, I mean, this is something everybody can do, is to keep out of the center aisles. Because if you look, most of the food is around the perimeter. You've got vegetables and fruits down one side, you've probably got some bread and meat and milk and so forth and cheese down the other. Just by saying, I'm going to eat primarily from the perimeter of the supermarket is a major step forward in supporting the farmer.
For both Clark and Renee, the sustainability of agriculture is making sure that the land continues to produce the food we need to pass along a viable farm to the next generation.
I hope to be able to farm till I'm age of 65, and if I have a son that wants to take over, a daughter, they'll be welcome to.
You certainly create a situation in which you can leave the land in better shape than you found it, and you know that you're giving people something to eat that will sustain them. I think maybe part of it is just, I think maybe for me personally, maybe the biggest part of it is to make the land what it is.
Is agriculture sustainable? Dr. Hill thinks it can be, but only if we're willing to make changes.
Two things to test what we're doing now. Is it nourishing people? And is it maintaining its resource base? And nobody can tell me that the present modern agriculture is doing either of those things. We need to take the best from the traditional experiences in agriculture and combine them with the best of the modern technologies. But in the short term, the first approach is what I call the efficiency approach. Maybe if we're going to put fertilizer on, let's put it where the plant is. The next step is to say, maybe we don't even want to use some of those things. Maybe there's some alternatives to pesticides, like a biological controller, to solve a problem that we've previously solved chemically. And maybe some of those biological ways are less harmful and perhaps more efficient and generally better for the system. And so that's what I call the substitution approach. We'll have to go through this efficiency and substitution stage before people sort of go, aha, you know, why not take a preventive approach? And it's very much parallel to the whole health field.
And the healthier crops are, the less susceptible they are to insect damage and competition from weeds.
There's a medical friend who said, think of it like this: you don't suffer from a headache because of a deficiency of aspirin in the blood. And you know, equally, you don't suffer from pests because of a deficiency of pesticide, but equally you don't suffer from them because you're not releasing some biological. It's really the design of the system, the way we've set it up and the way we manage it. And so that's what we've got to do to have a sustainable agriculture.
Let's look at what we've heard and relate back to the Sustainable Development Triangle. Number 1, the economy. Farmers need to make a living and we need affordable food. Number 2, the health of society. We want to know that the food on our table is nutritious and safe to eat. Number 3, the environment. We must work to sustain our environment so that it can be healthy and nourish us. It is up to all of us, the farmers and the consumers, to work together to make changes, to know where our food comes from and how it's produced, to make agriculture sustainable. After all, what is more important to our survival than food?
Whether things get better in the future or not, I guess depends to a great extent on the people that buy the food. If they decide that the food they want to buy is going to be food which is grown in a way which is good for the land and good for the people who grow it and good for them, then they'll buy it. If they decide that they want to continue to spend only 12 or 13% of their income on food that they eat at home, and they don't give a damn what happens to the soil and the people that are growing it, then it won't change. So I guess the decision is in the hands of the people that buy and eat the food.